Hi, welcome to our podcast. I'm Mary Abazia, and I have Tom Spitali and Sean Wellham with me. We're from Impact Planning Group. And what we're doing in this podcast is looking at we almost call it a buzzword. It's something that just seems to be a pattern with almost every client that we talk to. And most recently, and actually for a while, we keep hearing the word culture, and we hear it in situations where two companies have come together and they're trying to sort out their culture. Should they adopt one over the other, have a hybrid, go for something new? A new leader comes in and they want to create a new culture. So, we see almost every company trying to wrestle with culture. And as it relates to strategy, how does that fit together? What comes first, culture or strategy? And where can strategy help culture or hurt culture? So that's kind of the theme of what we're looking at. Does one of you want to take the next stab at this?
Sean does.
I'm just pausing, waiting to see if Tom's
This
going to
is
leap
his
in
birthday.
with
His birthday, so you
It's
got to
Sean's
go.
birthday. You got to go first.
his depth of wisdom. I think that when you think of any endeavor to drive something forward, ultimately strategy is about driving something forward, whether it's a sports team, a business, a political party, a military. There's always this idea of improving your lot through managing your existing resources in the face of existing competition and constraints. So when you accept that you're trying to progress, then culture becomes so important, because if you don't recognize it, you don't build it into the strategy, then you can create the wrong strategy that will never catch fire. It's like you're trying to light damp wood. You've got to get people excited and ready to move. And that first step becomes that you have to understand the culture. And the culture is really, I don't know, Tom, what you would say in terms of how to simplify it. 'Cause it's one of those, you mentioned, Mary, it's a buzzword. Everyone talks about culture. What is it? I always think of it as being, is your heart in this? Is your heart in the fight? And if you have a business that that everyone has a heart for the mission, the objective, the goal that you're trying to achieve, then to me, that's a big tick in the culture's right. Now we need structure and form and method. If the heart isn't in it, and that's how I think. I know I'll stop there, Tom, but I think culture is heart, and strategy could be, I guess you could argue, mind.
Well, I have a quick question for you, Sean. So, I understand you correctly that you're saying that you have to understand the culture before you do the strategy. Is there ever a good idea to create the strategy that then drives the culture?
Well, Tom obviously has a point, but let me answer that specifically. I think yes. I mean, I'm making a maybe a more common, that you need to understand the culture is part of the assets. That you start all strategy by looking at your resources and assets, your objective, and the constraints and competition. That's the sort of chessboard. And from that perspective, you need to understand the culture. But I believe you can shape culture through good, inclusive strategy. But Tom, I'm sure that was going to be roughly where you were heading with that, right?
It was. And by the way, if you're only listening on the audio podcast, Mary and I have fabulous new backgrounds. So if you want to get on the video podcast, you'll see them. I am in the wine cellar today. So.
And I'm in a room with 120 potential people coming in to do a lot of fun work. So.
And none of them are there yet.
No, and they're all post-pandemic and ready to meet each other after 2 quiet years.
Yes. So the
exotic backdrop is known as Sean's bookcase in his home office. Beautiful. I haven't changed it for several years, but it's functional. It works.
It's fantastic, Sean.
I need to get a green.
This is part of our culture. Is this part of our company culture?
Yeah.
Well, wine is definitely, wine and beer. Again, Sean's birthday. Anyway, culture.
Yeah, that's true, dear listener. It is my birthday today. Probably won't be when you listen to this, but just FYI, in case you want.
Sean's birthday today, 39. So, can strategy shape culture? I think the right approach to strategy can. And I don't want to sound like I am advocating for our approach, but I'm going to advocate for our approach, because really what we have found is the way we do strategy is we teach people a set of tools, thinking tools, that require certain types of behaviors, collaborative behaviors to work. The tools help cross-functional teams make decisions, and it makes the components of a strategic decision very explicit, such that people need to be able to have input to those components of the decision, see how decisions are being made, and ultimately come to a conclusion together. Now, to me, companies that can do that, they can collaborate cross-functional, have a spirited debate. Not, everybody has the opportunity to disagree and agree, and then when they're done, they move forward together towards execution. To me, that is a certain type of culture. It fixes a lot of things that are broken about culture. So my sense is that, you might think of culture as right brain and strategy as left brain, and, never the twain shall meet. But in my opinion, the right approach to strategy actually drives a culture in the direction that it needs to go in. And so that's my sort of counterintuitive approach to culture. Right strategy can create a great culture.
I think it
The right
needs
strategic
both.
process, I should say, not necessarily the strategy itself. The way the company goes about setting and building the strategy should be reflective of the culture that they want to that they want to have at their company.
But I
No,
think,
I think the
I
best.
agree, Tom, but you need both in parallel to some extent, because we've all seen a situation where somebody will pay lip service and say, yeah, okay, team, I want you to come up with your best ideas, challenge the status quo. I want you to think outside of the box. And then when it comes to the output and the review, it's like, yeah, we're not doing that. That's a dumb idea. And that reflects the real culture. And people knew that going in. People thought, okay, I'm going to be told that this is all a whole brave new world. And I suspect that the boss or the bosses are going to just have a very narrow selection criteria and will not accept anything that's outside of the norm. And that cultural reality then shapes how enthusiastically they follow the process and how much cynicism is built if it turns out that way. So I guess it needs a fertile place to start. You can't fix bad culture with strategy, but yeah, maybe you can shape it.
Ooh, I want to hear what Mary has to say, but I do think you can. Mary, go ahead. I think you
Yeah,
can
I
bad
I
culture.
think so too. I was thinking about companies that we've seen, and J&J, I think, has a good process. And it kind of is an iterative thing because they have the credo and they have a process that every year they check themselves to see if they're living the credo, and if not, where are the biggest areas that they need to address it. So it's a yin yang that they continue. I don't know if they would redo the credo if they found that the credo was out of, out of time. It needed to be updated because the world has changed since it was written. But I think that they're a really good example. Then you take GE, and they had or have a very clear culture. And you guys both worked there, so you breathed it and lived it.
Mhm.
And that one, I remember they were developing strategies, but the culture was so pervasive that even when they had great strategies, it was just too overwhelming. There was a river of being the best, being the first. Even if something was invented, I got to reinvent it again. Those types of things. So,
I
Well,
guess it's also, and I don't disagree, Tom, that of course it can shape strategy. What I'm trying to get to is I've had exposure to and worked with businesses and business partners where the culture has become so rotten and so dysfunctional that it requires a more radical fix than introducing a good strategy. You can't, it's not always it's not always possible, but it very often is, and it will certainly alleviate it. But when you see words on a page, credos and missions and so forth,
yeah.
again, you have to ask yourself how, if you ask the people in the business to say, how real is this? Enron had a pretty good mission statement.
Mhm.
Arrogance does not belong here was my favorite line from it. We want to treat
Arrogant does not
others
belong here.
like we
At
would be
Enron.
treated ourselves. And if you looked at the Enron mission statement, you might go,
Mhm.
these seem like good guys rather than
Right.
these seem like crooks, which they turned out to be. So I guess it's all about the reality check on culture, not
Well,
just the words plus action.
I want to go deeper on what I said because I think I can articulate it a little bit better. I don't think necessarily that strategy can drive culture. I think that the way that you do a strategic process, the way you develop your strategy, can be a way that reflects where you want to go with your culture. And the process of developing your strategy can be a laboratory for how much progress you are making towards that new culture that you want to develop. I think what a company has, basically, if you ask anybody who's interested in strategy and culture, what's right and what's wrong about the current culture? Where do you want to go from and to with your culture, the way work gets done, the way people treat each other? If you have a real solid plan, like I said, a from culture to culture plan, this is the kind of behaviors that we want to see that we're not seeing now. A collaborative strategic process is one of the best places to evaluate where you stand. How are people treating each other during the strategic process development, especially if it's cross-functional, collaborative, debate-filled? How is the debate going? Is it dominated by certain individuals? Is everybody being able to kind of provide and feel comfortable with providing their input? How are the leaders facilitating? Are they dominating? Are they drawing people out? How, in the process of building our strategy, how well or not well does it reflect the culture that we're trying to create? That's really what I'm trying to say. These two things can work together very, very well. They're not necessarily the same thing, but they can help drive each other.
I have a funny example where, to your point, collaboration is key. It's one of the important parts of the process. For this particular company, their problem was they were so collaborative that they were not productive. And so getting in a situation where you're working through the strategy and identifying the areas that are holding them back, it actually was quite funny. Everyone's so nice to each other that, it really takes a lot to get a group to go, okay, you can still be nice to people and you can collaborate, but you don't have to collaborate on everything. Pick a few things to collaborate on as our culture. So we're, because we like working with the people we work with, but you have to decide who's not going to go to the meetings, who should make the decision on something. So it is kind of funny, but once you kind of right size that, it takes a while. But there are situations where cultures are too nice and they have to draw some very strong lines in terms of how are we going to get stuff done, especially if they're growing and they have new people coming in. It's going to be very confusing to people. So,
and that's the key, isn't it? The key is you got to, and I think this is probably the biggest challenge, is understanding what the culture really is. Is it too nice? Is it too aggressive? Are the silos of individual power plays with the internal politics that infests most large organizations? And if you're the business leader, and I think you need to be a business leader to have that over the 360 degree of culture, because departments will have cultures, offices, locations will have their own mini cultures. Like it's like the weather, everyone's got their own little microclimates. But you want to see the big picture. You've got to see through that. And I don't think there's an easy answer to that, by the way. I think it's more of an aspiration. But if you don't recognize that you have an overly nice and overly inclusive and overly aggressive and overly cynical or what have you culture, that is part of the landscape that you're trying to shape with strategy, and you have to have a reality check as best you can.
I do believe that it just requires a little bit of focus and time to think about it and articulate it. Because I think that most of the people that we deal with, if you ask them to describe the culture, the goods and the bads, you know, it's one of the few things that you find if you have multiple people weighing in that they agree with right away. Cultures, I think company cultures, if you get enough input from enough different people, the themes are there. People say, oh, this is what we do. And people go, yeah, you know what? You're right. That's exactly how we do things, good and bad.
Yeah.
So I think you can, I think you can draw that out. And then, the strategic process, again, you have to make sure that your strategic process is cross-functional and collaborative. As long as it's those two things, then you can use that as a laboratory to change and move towards the things that you want to move. You can observe the good behaviors and the bad behaviors and say at the end of it, not only do we have a strategy, we're often asked at the end of a strategic engagement to weigh in on the culture and the individuals that were involved in the process. And we're very comfortable doing that because we see it very clearly.
I do think that the customer needs to weigh in. And I was thinking about the ways that we've seen companies do that well or not well. And when you engage a customer and are able to say, how is our culture touching you, or making you want to buy our stuff or not buy our stuff? One of the extreme examples was where a company went out and asked customers, and the customer said, I love your products, but you are so arrogant. I really wish I had another option because I don't enjoy buying stuff from you, but I like the stuff that you sell. And so that's a culture. And companies that are smart about saying the customer gets to vote on how our culture is affecting them, those are the ones that are smart enough to bake that into the future. But you have to be open-minded enough to say that the customer eventually will touch and feel your culture and probably should give you some feedback in the process.
Really great point, Mary, because you think about it, culture is not just the internal culture. I mean, I guess I've been focusing more on it as an internal thing about how people interact with each other, but ultimately every business is bigger than that. And as we're massive advocates for, it's the external, it's the outside in, it's the world that you're operating in that really counts. And that culture will also be felt by customers. And if you were to ask your customers, are we a customer obsessed, customer focused business? And your customers would answer, no, I don't feel that. Then building a strategy around that is going to be less successful than understanding what are the key things you need to have in place to be that business, and then develop strategies to maximize those opportunities. So I think the customer dimension is absolutely critical.
Agree. Great ad, Mary.
Thank you. Thank you. Always, anytime you get to say the customer in there, it adds something, because at the end of the day, they're the one that votes.
Yeah. Have we thought about the customer in this? That's a question you should ask under any circumstances.
Yeah, maybe that's one of the key takeaways is if you feel the need to change your culture, take the temperature with your customers first, and then try some things, and just like a big concept, is this going to help you? Tom?
My takeaway is that a strategic process absolutely can drive change in a culture, especially if you upfront, before you enter into that strategic process, talk about what's wrong with your culture, what direction you want to move in. The way you develop your strategy as a company can actually move you in the direction of the culture that you want to create. I think they're very strongly related.
And I agree with Tom on the premise that he set out, which is that you understand the culture. So I'm just going to, I don't want to leave it on a cynical note or a skeptical note, but I would just say that the biggest failure mode is not grasping what the culture really is. And that is absolutely key. You've got to have some brutal reality before you fix it. And once you understand it, yes, you can fix it with strategy. But if you don't understand it, you're blindfolded.
Yeah, very well put. Very well put. Because you are so wise, because it is your birthday. So anyway,
once a year. And today is the day. You lucky people.
Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, everybody.